Hi, everyone. My name is Jeff Green, director of the Andre Mitchell Center, and just want to thank you all for being here with us today for this event on democratizing finance. Finance is not always seen as the primary site for democracy and democratization, which I think is part of what makes it such an interesting topic to pursue. It's also a site that has been dramatically transformed by new technologies, including blockchain. And thus, this event today is part of a year-long series that the Mitchell Center is conducting along with its partner, Perry Worldhouse, on democracy and emergent technologies. And so I direct you to the Mitchell Center website for information about the other monthly events that we still have in store for the rest of this academic year. I just want to thank the people who have been a part of planning this event. Tom Shattuck and LaShawn Jefferson from Perry Worldhouse have been our partners throughout. Just want to acknowledge the planning committee that has been meeting for well over a year in planning this year's series, and in particular, Christopher Yu and Benjamin Shestakovsky, who were very much involved with envisioning this event. And I really want now to thank our moderator for today, Rishan Sharma, who will then introduce our two distinguished speakers. Rishan is the founder and student director of the Blockchain Laboratory at the Stevens Center for Innovation in Finance. During his time there, he started the Cypher Accelerator, Wharton's first ever blockchain-focused startup accelerator with advisors including Mark Cuban, Tim Draper, and other leaders in the blockchain space. He also led the university's efforts in minting its first NFT, partnering with Penn Medicine and Dr. Drew Weissman to create a first-of-its-kind NFT of the mRNA vaccine patent that was sold at Christie's auction house. He previously was an investor at CoinFund, and his research interests in blockchain are focused in decentralized artificial intelligence, zero knowledge, and Web3 gaming. So thank you so much, Rishan, for being our moderator. We look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Jeff, here we are. Hey, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out. Really looking forward to a fun, open conversation on some really interesting topics with some incredible panelists today. So I'll just start out with introducing who we have today. So on the furthest left, we have Sir MICHAEL MCCARTHY, who's an economic democracy activist and associate professor at sociology at Marquette University. Much of his work is on power and finance. He's the author of the award-winning book, Dismantling Solidarity, Capitalist Politics and American Pensions Since the New Deal, which examines failed efforts by ordinary American workers and unions to gain control of their own pension funds. He is co-editor of the volume Rethinking Class and Social Difference. In addition to peer-reviewed journals, he is also a regular contributor to the Jacobin magazine and has advanced public debates with about economic democracy in venues such as the Washington Post, Boston Review, Renewal, and Tribune magazine. He is currently undertaking several projects around economic justice, including a proposal to create public investment banks and funds operated by randomly selected assemblies of ordinary people, which hopefully we'll get into that a bit today. Our other panelist is JANE KHODARKOVSKY, and she's the General Counsel at the Celo Foundation, where she oversees legal, risk, and regulatory functions. The Celo Foundation was founded in 2017 with a mission of supporting the growth and development of decentralized open source mobile first Celo blockchain ecosystem. Prior to her current role, she was a federal and state prosecutor, most recently as a trial attorney and human trafficking finance specialist for the U.S. Department of Justice Money Laundering and Asset Recovery Section. She investigated and prosecuted financial crimes, money laundering, human trafficking, and child exploitation cases. Before joining the DOJ, she prosecuted enterprise corruption, scheme to defraud, public corruption, and tax fraud schemes at the New York County District Attorney's Office and the New Jersey Attorney General's Office. Jane, Mike, thank you so much for joining us today. And why don't we start out with a pretty simple question, which I'll put over to you, Mike. But fundamentally, like what the series is about and what we're going to be getting at today, the heart of the issue is why is there a greater need for democracy in finance? So maybe if you can like detail what you see like you really need in the space right now.
Is this thing on? There we go. Well, first off, thank you for having me. I appreciate the opportunity to speak and hopefully learn from the panelists and also the participants in the Q&A. Well, I think it's important to to start by saying that there's been not a rapid, but a very major transformation in both American capitalism, but most advanced capitalist countries since around the 1970s. And that's been the growth of the financial sector, both in terms of percentage of GDP, but also in terms of its intertwining in people's lives. This is, at first glance, it might seem like a good thing. There's more opportunities to invest. There's with greater volatility comes maybe a little bit of a greater opportunity to make money. But the sort of impact on ordinary people's lives has been actually quite devastating from my perspective. As finance has grown, we've seen a slowdown in actual productive growth in advanced rich democracies. We've seen a slowdown in terms of GDP slowly since the 1970s, but also a slowdown in actual industrial production, slowdown in sort of the creation of new good jobs. And as that has occurred, more and more people have been sort of sucked into relations of debt. Poor people have found themselves increasingly searching out new sources of income because the welfare state has been slowly withered away since around the 1990s. And that has led to a turn towards essentially payday loan, check cashing sort of banking, which essentially charges usurious interest rates. And for middle income and sort of traditional workers, we've seen a sort of stagnation of income since the 1970s, which has led to a turn towards credit cards, a turn towards more and more debt. And this increased debt burden is only matched by the increased macroeconomic instability that financialization creates. Financial assets are interesting. They're unlike, say, a cup of Evian water, right? If the price of this water goes up, I'm less likely to buy it, right? As the price of water goes up, as price of a typical good goes up, demand typically goes down. Financial assets are different. When the price of a financial asset goes up, actually demand goes up. And that demand goes up and it creates essentially a bubble, right? And eventually the bubbles pop. And that's what the economist Minsky basically had a theory of financial crisis, which really, it echoes in many ways some of the downturn in crypto today, which showed that as you get sort of the rise of speculative assets, with cheaper debt, those assets become more and more risky. And eventually that leads to somewhat Ponzi schemes type structures, which pop eventually, and people lose a lot of money. So that essentially, it sort of underscores the fact that we live in a volatile time, a time of increasing economic crisis, increasing volatility. So why should we think about democratizing finance? I think the question is, the answer is rather straightforward. We need to find sources of productive investment for our society. We need to find sources of stability for ordinary working people, and we need to find sources of investment for a just green transition. And the only way that you do that is through some kind of coordinated investment structure, right? You might let the market decide, but the market hasn't solved those problems. You might let states alone decide, but states alone haven't solved those problems. So I think it's actually maybe of use for this panel that what's interesting is how we design those systems for actually achieving that kind of investment. What do those systems actually look like, and how do we kind of organize people into democratic decision-making bodies, if you think about it like that?
Yeah, definitely. Thanks so much for that introduction. I think that you've touched on a lot of the points that we're going to be diving a little bit deeper into today, and maybe now shifting more towards the application level. on how, as you had mentioned, blockchain might be used as a potential solution to address some of the problems that you had brought up. Jane, maybe it would be great to hear your perspectives on how blockchain can be used generally as a technology to help solve these problems and alleviate some of the things that Mike had mentioned earlier on.
Thank you. Well, thank you for having us. I'm really pleased to have this conversation. I think this is the right time to have this conversation. I'll give a small anecdote because I think I came into the blockchain space in a fairly unique way. I spent most of my career as a prosecutor focused on following the money of bad actors, whether individuals or companies, to be able to make victims whole, whether they were victims of sex trafficking or forced labor or child exploitation. And it's interesting, Mike, that you mentioned check cashers, because in New York, there were a lot of vulnerable victims who were exploited in some workforce by either the company or an individual in the company, and forced to go to check cashers to cash their checks. And then maybe their trafficker or whoever the individual or company I was investigating would take that cash. And the difficulty of being a prosecutor or investigator when people use cash is it disappears. It's very hard to follow the money when someone has cash. What I think is really interesting about blockchain, the technology, right? And we sort of talked a little bit about this. I think words really matter. I used to say this when I was talking about human trafficking cases. There's a difference between human trafficking and human smuggling. And so today, what I hope if you take anything away from this, is that blockchain is a technology that I look at as a public highway that, if built right, can be used and be accessible and transparent to anyone in the world. I think we're in a unique position being in the United States where many people can go and feel comfortable that if they go to their traditional financial institution or their bank and go to get that money will be there. That's a privilege. There are many people around the world that can't trust their financial institutions or can't trust their governments. And I think when I was working with the victims of trafficking, or had my own personal experience, having been an immigrant from Ukraine and seen how much money it costs for everyday people to send money back home, there's a reason why, and we all know the Western Unions of the world, the MoneyGrams of the world, they charge a very high fee to send money across, and it takes days. And I'll go even a step further. There are places in this world where the brick and mortar store for Western Union or MoneyGram or whatever that money transmission business is, it's like a place where bad actors know that if someone is going to get money there, it's much easier to victimize them or take their money away. And the beauty, I think, of what we saw, unfortunately, because of COVID, was that there was studies that there was an increase in certain communities in the US using Bitcoin or other digital assets to send remittances back home to their communities. And one of the things about, for example, Celo, it's a mobile first. All you need is a mobile device and a phone number. You don't need to memorize very long, numbers and figures. You don't need a sophisticated phone, and it does not expose somebody potentially to having to pay exorbitant fees for the hard-earned money that they earn here in the US or somewhere else to send back to their family or friends. So I think when we talk about the technology and what it can be used for, there's a huge difference than, to your point, Mike, about the speculative aspect that I think has really controlled the narrative over this new technology. And what I hope is that the focus will really be on the use cases and how do we empower people, not just in the US, but around the world who may not have access to traditional finance so that they can get the education, that they can travel, that they can support their own communities, and it becomes empowering to everyone and not just for a small group of people. And I think that's a lot of what your research is about.
Yeah, exactly. And Mike, in that vein, and kind of along the lines of the problems that you both have highlighted so far, kind of posing the next question. So how have activists and policy makers responded to the different problems that have risen within finance? I know one of them, which we'll discuss further on, is blockchain, but maybe to set the tone for the conversation, we can outline, like, since the 2008 financial crisis, kind of how that evolution has been shaped.
One of the actually very exciting things about the times we live in, as bad as they are in many ways, is that there's been a huge amount of experimentation with alternative systems thinking, alternative ways of thinking about finance, but also many other things. And I mean, crypto and sort of blockchain is one example of this, but it's not the only example. And since essentially the financial crisis, there's been like a really flourishing of different kinds of ideas. One I think about as it's kind of like there's an effort to change financiers' normative orientation to the world, and that's kind of like things like ESG investing, which is an environment, social, and governance. It's basically investing principles. The most famous being the UN Principles for Responsible Investment, which literally everybody is signed up to. Like Goldman Sachs. I mean, everybody and anybody in between that is an institutional investor or a major investor is signed up onto these things. And part of this kind of effort is essentially to change the narrative about investing to sort of consider social, environmental. It's principally about environmental impacts. That's one thing. I think largely I'm very skeptical about ESG. I think it entails a lot of greenwashing, and it in fact has not had a major impact. People disagree with me, but it is telling that like the major backers of the Saudi Aramco essentially offering, we're also signed up to the UN PRI. So you have like these kind of normative efforts. How do we change how people think about finance? You have basic regulatory efforts, sort of a return of Glass-Steagall, more bank oversight about financial malfeasance, things along that lines, Bernie Sanders' idea, if you remember, of breaking up banks that are too big to fail. So that's another kind of approach, which I think when I think about those kind of approaches, it's like people want to return to this ideal moment of the post-New Deal period in the 1950s, and they want to make finance look how it looked back then, which I don't think is feasible because capital has changed in massive ways. Then you have, I think, where we get into a little more interesting areas, where you have kind of ideas, which I would put like various crypto and blockchain projects, supplemental experiments that are kind of meant to sort of exist outside the existing financial system, maybe crowd it out or provide an alternative to. And so you might have various coin projects, but you could have things like sovereign wealth funds. You can have things like public investment banks, basically financial institutions that are set up as like an alternative to the existing system. And then finally, there's efforts to control existing pools of finance. Right now, the asset managers like Vanguard, State Street, BlackRock, the big three, they manage the assets of on average 20% of the equities of every single corporation in the world. It's pretty astounding, right? And so there are already massive pools of finance, oftentimes in people's pension funds, that are folks are trying to think about, how do we actually manage those pools ourselves? How do we have a greater say? And that goes back a long time. There's been the union movement in the US and elsewhere have long tried to think about ways of investing worker finance. So there's a flourishing of different ideas, and sort of in some ways they're complementary, in other ways maybe competing. But I think it's quite an exciting time to be able to think, what are the different approaches that we can think about for finance in this space? Which are better? Which are worse? What's going to produce the best outcome, and what's going to give the greatest amount of say for ordinary people for their own finance? I mean, there's just very briefly, I would just say, there's really two reasons why we might think about democratizing finance at all. One's an intrinsic reason, right? It's a moral reason. Well, because we think people should have greater self-control and self-governance over their lives, right? They should have a greater say over how sort of the allocation of investment works, which impacts them, right? But there's also an instrumental reason, right? If we think that democratizing finance can actually solve important social problems, which I think it can, then it's not just the right thing to do because it's fair, or it's best for people's individual freedoms or their individual capacities, but it's also a potential way to solve the major crises that are bearing down on us in terms of climate investment and investing in people that are essentially completely marginalized in our society.
Yeah, definitely very helpful. And just following up exactly in that vein, I'll redirect it back to you, Jane. So whenever it comes to specific applications of blockchain technology to do different things, you had mentioned universal basic income, creating digital identity, which is something which is very prevalent and pertinent among a lot of different geographies, especially outside the United States. And generally just serving underbanked communities. Maybe if you could discuss like how blockchain is being used right now today in those kind of applications and how it's changing lives, as Mike had mentioned.
Yeah, sure. I think part of why, to Mike's point about entrepreneurial spirits, right, is that people want to improve their own lives and their communities, not just in the US, right, or outside. And I always think, I was at an event in New York during the UN General Assembly, and there was a presentation, and there was a statistic about how how many financial deserts exist in New York State for communities that do not have a bank. And I thought a lot about that, because I think there are a lot of really interesting work being built on different blockchains. There's some projects on Celo specifically that are focused on universal basic income that are not just meant to improve one person's life, but really helping their community. So there are ideas around community currencies, and how do we empower small business owners and their community to go and invest in those communities so that you're bringing income back where you live, right? Or those small community banks, so that we're not just talking about large financial institutions. How do we improve? There's a project called Ethic Hub. They're focused on Mexico, Guatemala, and Kenya, and specifically small farmer communities, so that they can save and be able to grow their own community and their own independence. And it's interesting because Mike and I are talking about kind of the environmental impact and sustainability. And interesting that you're saying who signs on, right, to these who holds them accountable is my question. And the beauty of blockchain is that it is public, which means anyone can go and see what's happening on the blockchain. And there is transparency. And it's immutable, meaning you can't erase it. And if someone tries to change it, anyone who is watching the blockchain can see that. So when I used to, and again, I'm not in government now, but when I used to look at companies and corporate responsibility and how far down the supply chain they can see because they have subcontractors or the workers are overseas, and you ask, oh, well, you have a child working in that cocoa field in Mali. Did you know that? And the company says, no, there's no way I could see that. The blockchain has smart contracts, so you can program them and they're mathematical. So they can do all the things that a multinational company may allegedly not be able to see, or my question is maybe not want to see. And so I think the application and the use and education around how can we use this technology to improve lives in a very real world way is really key to getting that buy-in that's not just speculative or just regulatory from the state side, because we saw that also with the events in Afghanistan and Ukraine, and people started turning to alternative means, sometimes with Bitcoin, and they were looking for independence, but they also wanted privacy, because all of a sudden their life changed within 24 hours and they either could not, but they didn't, but they wanted to be secure and safe. And I think that is part of the question about how do we also build in those protections with the new technology, because you have accountability for what you're putting out in the world, and how do we measure that? And then the last thing I'll say is with respect to real world assets on chain. There's a lot of projects around in Latin and South America and in the US, but in Africa, but focused on carbon offsets and making sure that real world assets are being brought on chain to hold accountable and really for everyone to see, to avoid that greenwashing. That if you're saying, and a company is saying that we're going to retire X amount of carbon offsets, that there's accountability for that. And that it is not something that you rely on someone in corporate headquarters to report once a year in their annual report to their shareholders, that it's really visible to everyone. And I think that's where, it's not just passing the law, it's enforcing it and holding those actors accountable and making sure that we trust the technology. But trusting a technology also involves education, use, making people feel comfortable that this really is what it purports to be. And I think that's really important too.
Definitely. I think like you've touched on a lot of the key points that, when it comes to the fundamental technology, like what this really enables in terms of value creation and accessibility, which are really core to the tech, but maybe the application, which we can discuss a little further, isn't being used for that specifically right now. Mike, I would love to hear kind of like your response in one thing that you had mentioned that you do within your research is a question of democratizing finance solely through blockchain, and what potential limitations might exist by relying or being overly reliant on one technology specifically, and what your thoughts are around that.
Yeah. No, that's useful. I think maybe just to get into that, to step back first, just to say what exactly do we mean by democracy and democratizing finance, or X, whatever it could be. In this debate, this idea of democratizing finance was really kind of kicked off by Yale economist Robert Shiller, a book he wrote in the 90s. I think it was called The Good Society or something along those lines. But in any case, like the argument in the book was basically that it was a financial inclusion argument. It was all about how democratizing finance is all about giving access to ordinary people, the retail investor, to financial markets, which were overwhelmingly being invested by rich people. And the idea is that, well, you know, wealthy people are benefiting from these financial markets. Ordinary people should too, like that. And so that's kind of like the idea of democracy is an access question. And I think that's incredibly important. I think access to sort of sort of wealth creation is a fundamental thing, and it's an injustice that it's unequally distributed. But I think it's important also to think about democracy at a slightly deeper level than just access, but more at the level of say, actual control over the flow of investment, the actual decisions about how things are invested. The given model that we have, and this is largely true of crypto, although there might be interesting experiments that Jane's involved in that suggest otherwise, that we should look, you know, we should zoom in on. The given model is that people that sort of invest in financial markets, whether it be Bitcoin or the stocks of a company, are investing because they're trying to make money, right? They're trying to make money. That's the whole point of it. And that sort of basic logic of trying to make money in key ways, it skirts the problems that are facing our society, right? It doesn't actually address these deep fundamental crises that I think we need to address. My perspective is that to address those things, you actually need a deeper form of democratizing finance. You need a capacity for ordinary people to come together to discuss what should be invested in, to sort of to make decisions about what should be invested in, and then to allocate credit into those things, right? That to me is that deliberative participatory aspect of democracy, to me is fundamental. And I'm not saying that blockchain can't do that. I'm just saying that it hasn't done that. And it's the trend, if you look at the crypto markets, has been, one, increased plutocracy. There's been a huge concentration of control of things like Bitcoin. I think 1% of Bitcoin investors control 2/3 of all Bitcoin. Only 16% of Americans have ever even invested in crypto. So most people aren't even involved in it. It's totally, you know, right? It's and within the crypto space and within sort of like DAOs, they're principally run on the basis of one coin, one vote, which means that the people that have the most coins in most of the different projects, this is not necessarily true of all, because there is actually interesting experimentation along these lines. Most of them are run by small numbers of people. Okay, so then what's the next effect of that? Not only has it produced increased plutocracy, it also just reinforces, in large part, this is not true of all things, and I'm willing to be totally wrong on this. It also reinforces an economic logic into sort of more and more areas of life, right? It creates norms about sort of speculative investing into new areas. In many ways, it's about financializing democracy as opposed to democratizing finance, because it creates financial logics in things like, you know, NFTs and a variety of other new digital assets, right, that are tied to different things, right? And the third thing is that in this, and this might actually be totally what Jane is doing, so I could be totally fundamentally wrong on this. But the third thing I would say is that it actually creates externalities that it can't deal with. Blockchain, I mean, this is now not necessarily true of Ethereum since the merge, but like blockchain production uses an incredible amount of energy, in a given year, it uses about the same amount of energy that Argentina, the entire country, or Australia uses. So there's massive environmental externalities, and part and parcel of that is that it can't actually account for creation of public goods. It can't create social infrastructure. It can't create sort of massive retrofitting of buildings to make them green. It can't create universal health care. It can't create sort of public parks. If it can, it hasn't. That's my point. And so I think that to do those things, actually, we need to think about how we can incorporate human beings into the decision-making process about how finance is allocated. What do we prioritize with our investments? And it might absolutely be the case that there's a use case for blockchain in that. Maybe there's a technological use case for blockchain in solving real world problems in exactly the way that JANE is commenting on, but for the other areas of crises. But I guess my skepticism is that it hasn't done that in the main. The main upshot of cryptocurrency has been volatility and financial ruin for a lot of people, right? I mean, who do you think invested in crypto after the Super Bowl? Ordinary people, ordinary people. And in fact, it was disproportionately Black and Latino people who invested in it after the Super Bowl and after the Spike Lee commercial about how you're missing out. It was Black and Latino people who invest in crypto 2 times more than white people in the US. Got in very late, right after the Super Bowl, and if you invested a lot of money, that's a rapid downturn. So I think we need to think kind of seriously about what mechanisms are we gonna create for financial say over financial investment, as opposed to just inclusion in a financial scheme or system or project. No, just my thought.
Very, very interesting. Jen, I would love to hear what response you kind of have to the skepticism and kind of lines and points that Mike has laid out. Are there fundamental flaws within the technology itself? Is this something that maybe over time will develop and ease? As you had mentioned on the ESG point, technologies seem to alleviate that problem, but any response to what Mike has said?
Sure. So first, I think I'm going to go back to my first statement about what words we use is important. There are cryptocurrencies or digital assets that certainly have been used for speculation, and that's true. And that's true of any instrument that we as society give value to. There's also blockchain, the technology, which, similar to the internet, isn't going to go away tomorrow. I think part of the and to your point about Bitcoin and proof of work, which I don't know sort of the level of knowledge here, but Bitcoin requires mining, and Celo, which does have a decentralized protocol similar to now Ethereum, is proof of stake. And part of the reason why Celo was created as a proof of stake was because one of its pillars was sustainability and regenerative finance for positive climate externalities. And so how you build and use the technology is really important. If I had a victim of human trafficking who could not get access to a bank account because her trafficker had ruined her credit score, there's no financial institution or process that we have in place now that allows for that person to, as I used to say, not just become a survivor in our society, but a thriver. And blockchain technology, if we can think outside of what we traditionally believe. For example, digital identity is that you need to have a passport or you need to have a driver's license. That doesn't work for every community. And the smart contracts and the engineering and the development that can go into this technology can be used for good. And we should talk about those good use cases. There should be, in my opinion, more discussions about how communities in rural parts of the US are using blockchain to help them with their farming, or accountability for how much they worked and what they should be paid. I think we should be talking about how the government, when they give grants or procurement, can hold those third parties that they're contracting overseas not to use forced labor and enforce that. Because those are ways, to your point about NFTs, I always laugh because the only thing you hear about with NFTs are like Bored Apes. And that's cool. And I get it. Like who didn't want to collect baseball cards, right? I moved to the US in 1992 and I learned that everyone had baseball cards, or if you're a boy, that's what you were collecting. But NFTs are non-fungible tokens that can also be used, and I work with projects to do compliance, to do due diligence, to know your customer and create an NFT that someone could use like a compliance passport, whether they're in the US or abroad. We did that for COVID in New York. I'm a New York resident. I have something on my app that says, you know, how many booster shots I got or when I got it. If you can create that and use compliance, then that person who may not have been able to get access to the account at Citi or another, like a Vanguard account, those are privileges. You have to have savings to go and invest. And I think that education and that really thoughtful understanding of the technology is really important. You mentioned DAOs, which are decentralized autonomous organizations. They're an interesting idea. Many of them start from a social perspective. People want to have a say in a community about what happens. I know we'll get to this, but I also think it's important to have thoughtful regulation so that right now in the US at least, the legal framework around DAOs is fairly unclear. It's not like a limited liability company, right, that insulates its members. DAOs don't have that right now, and there's a lot of discussion. But there are a lot of DAOs focusing on, there's a Ukraine DAO that was basically set up in order to help facilitate and get funds and necessary goods and use blockchain to track supply so that if someone donates $5 million for a generator in Kharkiv, you know, and you can watch that that money goes to that generator in that hospital. We're not talking about that. That's not what you hear on primetime news, because unfortunately, I think there's a lot of discussion, to your point, about the speculation and what happens if you invest in X. And I don't know how we change that from a social media or a media perspective. I think the best answer is you try to show people, you try to educate, you try to bring in mission-aligned partners, and you have conversation. I think scrutiny is always important, because that makes you better. If you want to be a good actor, and this goes to my prosecutor days, you have to, the government also has to enforce the laws that exist against the bad actors, because then you weed out those bad actors and the good actors will hopefully be able to continue to do good. And that doesn't matter what the industry is. It doesn't matter if it's a financial institution. There's plenty of fraud that I used to investigate and prosecute of traditional finance as well. So I think it's nuanced and it is not simple, and it's an evolving and maturing space. And it's important to have thoughtful people. And I get excited by how many projects from around the world and people thinking, even on my way here, I had a conversation with a woman who's trying to figure out how to build a digital ID using blockchain. That's really inspiring. That's really great. that means it's not for speculation, or there are people who want to use it for good. But it's not going to happen overnight, and we have to incentivize that, right? There have to be incentives for people who want to build in this space too.
Definitely. Mike, is there something you want to quickly add?
I just want to ask a question.
Yeah, definitely.
I mean, this comes from a position of ignorance, and so I'm just curious. What percentage of the kind of socially oriented projects that you see in the blockchain space are not about finance at all, but are about solving some problem? I guess it might seem like a loaded question, because I think the bulk of the reason why people discuss the speculative aspects of crypto is because that is the largest part of the space. Like it is the financialized.
Yeah, so I think
Right,
it's
like-
the largest that is promoted. It's the largest because you hear about how a venture capital firm invested in something that is supposed to be speculative, or you hear about the exchanges on which these assets are being traded. It's hard for me to honestly to give you a percentage, because I guess I'm fortunate in some ways to be surrounded by mission aligned people. And I also am a former prosecutor who does due diligence and compliance, and that weeds out a lot of people that may be not doing what they should be doing. But I would tell you that one of the things that I see a lot is identifying a problem in a community and trying to solve for that. That's how like the ethic hubs of the world started, or the people who are trying to figure out how do you create an NFT of a deed so that you don't have to be afraid that you're going to lose that piece of paper, or whether or not, it's been formalized. Like, I think it's interesting because even just in the last 2 months, right? There was a court that approved service of process through posting it on Twitter. There is a New York court that allowed service of process through an NFT. And those are interesting because those are ways that the legal community is starting to use this technology. There are also artists who used to have no ability to earn money based on the contracts for the songs that they've written. And now they create an NFT and they're able to earn money directly. It's their work and it's their earnings. So yes, it's financial, but it's also a sense of ownership of what you're doing. And that's something that is independent of someone controlling or telling you how many times you can play a song or who owns the art you created. So those are just, I think those are interesting examples from very different stuff, areas of the world.
Yeah, definitely fascinating. And I'll just say, coming up, I'll ask a final question, but it would be great to hear from you all in the audience. If you have any questions, feel free to line up at the microphone on the far side of the room. But kind of taking it back to some of the points that we've been touching throughout the conversation today, in some of the possibilities that might exist within the technology of blockchain, and kind of maybe the state in which it is in today. In the future, where hypothetically blockchain can be used to solve some of these issues in democratizing finance, what change is needed in the public perception and how this technology is evolved and reaches the masses? Mike, what would you like to see to basically serve the bigger purpose that you've outlined is so important and central to this conversation in democratizing finance, and Jane as well, whether it's regulatory changes or more oversight, what exactly is needed?
Doesn't matter. I'll go. Okay. there's a technology that I'm pretty interested in, which goes all the way back to ancient Greece. And it's called the claratorion. And it was these large cement boxes where they had little slates. And then different sort of members of the citizenry would put their names on the slates. And then when they had to choose people to do all sorts of different things, everything from the Council of 500 that oversaw the Athens, to the people that had to clean the temples after the festivals and stuff, to the people that maintained the roads. They would randomly select people from this box to sort of essentially assemble those groups of decision makers. Of course, women were not included, slaves were not included. It was a horrible system in many ways. But the technology, I think, is actually quite an interesting one, and there has actually been some toying with it in like the blockchain DAO space as well. But I part of what I'm really excited about is using that random selection process to choose people at different scales, whether it be a municipality, the nation, maybe even at a planetary scale, to create sort of bodies of people to create mandates for different forms of public investment. You could think about this like in a very simple, straightforward way, a municipal bank, right? You could have a municipal bank that would essentially be run by randomly selected people. You could have a body of people that decide what the basic investment mandates of the bank should be. You could have a body of people that do oversight. You could have a body of people that hire the basic kind of operations managers and the people that run the operational divisions. And I think that's an exciting way of actually bringing people into the decision-making process about finance in a way that isn't hedged on what they're going to get out of it financially. It's about a community building project and about sort of addressing common problems. And there might be a blockchain usage for that. And I'd be totally interested in that. But I think that's something that excites me. The idea about democratizing finance has kind of stalled in a lot of ways from this kind of more public perspective, because most of what we think about when we think about public finance is something like, I don't know, the Goss Bank in the USSR, one financial entity that is the bureaucratic bankers are like making decisions about how all the social investments are going, and that's a calamity in and of itself. It's a system that produces huge principal agent problems and doesn't actually incorporate people into the decision-making process. And so I think that's something that I'm quite excited about, and something that I do work on. And if there is like a blockchain kind of usage for that, I would be totally open to it. But for me, the fundamental point is that democratizing finance should not simply be about access. It should be about actual deliberation and say over how social investment works. Right now, that is done overwhelmingly by individuals simply deciding where they put their money, or principally by large corporations deciding where they put their money. But if we want to solve public issues, we can't leave them up to private individuals. We have to have actual deliberative debate about how that allocation works. And so that to me is the fundamental point. And to the extent that blockchain can be part and parcel of that, I would welcome it. And I'd be definitely open to sort of like learning about how as well. That's fine.
Yeah. I think there needs to be a lot of education even to get to like the empowering people to have enough information, how information is accessible to people, even outside of blockchain, in order to, because the first impediment is access, right? And in different communities and different countries, it can have a lot of different, can look very different. But I also think that we have to, when we talk about blockchain, and this comes up a lot, like it can only be one or the other. It shouldn't be one or the other. There should be a bridge. And there should be a compassion and understanding and discussion about how we get to that bridge. And in order to get that mass adoption, you were talking about, like, I haven't seen all of the fixes by blockchain of social issues. A lot of these social issues have existed for decades, if not hundreds of years. And I think it would be impossible for new technology that is innovating and growing and changing all the time. When someone says, like, what do you think the next thing in the digital asset space or the Web3 space is going to be? I don't know. It changes every day. There's something new or new project or new development that I learn about every day, truly every day. And it's inspiring, but I also think that clear rules of the road where we allow people to experiment within their communities, experiment within their countries, and celebrating the public goods that people are creating. Because I think when we only focus on, is this a financial instrument? Is someone making a profit off of that? It's simplifying. It's very simple. It doesn't get to the heart of the real issues. It is inspiring when the Mayo Clinic is using blockchain technology for clinical studies. Maybe that will mean that someday certain medicines will be easier for certain communities to get than they are today, or they'll be cheaper for certain people to buy them. Those are the things that I hope that in 5 years, if we're all here, we're talking about that there's less conversation about, well, someone did an ad during the Super Bowl, and then people with less information, with less access to education about it, are the victims. Consumer protections are critical for this to have mass adoption. And we have to be able to identify those issues and really kind of within the industry too. If you want to mature as an industry, you have to think about how to solve for that. How do you protect people's data? How do you protect people's money? Don't overpromise something that you're not going to deliver. And that's an issue in traditional finance as well. And not just in the US, but abroad. So I hope that in a few years' time, we'll be talking more about how we've solved for those social ills Mike is talking about, because that would really, I think, help more people, and not just in the US, because we're always so US focused, but there's like millions and billions of people who don't get the privilege of being here, you know, and attending schools like this and having this debate. And I want those people to be able to have these discussions. And I think, and I hope that this technology will get there, but it's the use that matters. And I want the focus to be on the use and less on the speculation any day of the week.
Thank you so much, both of you guys, for that. I think it's a very interesting framing looking forward for all of us as we leave today. But at this point in time, would love to open up to some audience questions. Oh, awesome.
Okay, as a disclaimer, I was in a PhD program here before many of you were born. McNeil Building, Dietrich Hall when it was a dump, and so on. And I worked for a major money center bank and retired like a few months ago. So I'm kind of biased.
Congratulations.
For some reason I came back to Philadelphia, which probably is a black, I don't know, black mark or what. And I don't know that I have necessarily a question. I do have, and I listened to everything and I sort of disagreed or questioned so much of what was said. You know, the whole issue about productivity, growth, and the financialization of society, and I think that that's there's a lot more to it. I think this session would have been better if we had divorced blockchain from digital assets. Bitcoin, etc. Bitcoin, etc. I do as a Ponzi scheme. Tulips, you know, South Sea bubbles, all those things we learned about. And when you look at all the ongoing scandals and bankruptcies and lack of regulation, etc., I think it would have been much better just to have focused on blockchain and what blockchain is and what blockchain can do, etc. And again, there I have so many questions because I look at, for example, the failure of the blockchain project at the ASX. And now they spent, what, $170 million and then said, well, it didn't work. Because I think there's a lot we can do, you know, when you look at the limited capabilities of the new technologies versus what a Visa or MasterCard is doing every day at very low cost. But one of the points I would, I'm going on, I apologize. There's this whole question about community investing and having people invest, you know, have a say. And I think we've always got to distinguish between my investing as an individual is investing in a financial asset. It's not building a hospital or a factory. And so I think we've got to really separate. When we're talking about investment, we've got to separate. Because me as an individual, I'm probably a horrible investor. You know, I can never, if I can tell you how much money I've lost. I can never have enough information. And to somehow say, therefore, that we collectively, the people in this room, you know, if we were all in one community, would really know what we should be doing and have enough information. You know, it's all very, and I go back to the whole issue, for example, of 401ks and how if you give people a choice, you know, that you employ them. If you say the default is you fully invested in a 401k, or the default is it's up to you. No one will invest in a 401k. And I think that we've got that issue when it comes to this investment. Oh, and as a final thought, Bob Schiller was an assistant professor of economics when I was at Penn. So, yeah. I know there's no question in there, but
No problem. Thank you.
I could respond though.
Yeah, go for it. I think maybe to boil down to a question on the success of like collective investing, I think that could be an interesting point to address. But anything you'd like to respond to?
Yeah, no, I think you framed your comment as a criticism, but I think was actually entirely consistent with what I was saying about sort of your perspective as an individual investor versus, I mean, it sounded like you were saying that collectively people aren't any better than individuals, and I would disagree with that. There's some really interesting research in cognitive science, but also in democratic political theory about democratic decision making. I would suggest a book by Helene Landemore called Democratic Reason. The argument of the book I think is like quite counterintuitive. she argues, drawing from this cognitive science that's out there, that actually when you get a group of people together, if the group of people is more cognitively diverse and diverse in terms of their own background, they're actually much better at solving problems than a group of people that are very intelligent but very similar, right? And the idea is kind of fairly straightforward, but it's not intuitive at first, because you're like, oh, smart people should be better at solving problems. But the idea is that when people are coming to problems from different perspectives, it allows them to see multiple dimensions of the problem and to kind of come to a better conclusion at the end. And that's what's I think is underlying my sort of claim about collective decision-making processes and pools of finance. The idea that you actually don't invest your money in a way as an individual for the collective good, right? I'm somebody with a retirement fund. When I look at my retirement account, I'm exclusively concerned with how much it is made or lost, right? It's about my financial situation. If I were put into a situation where I could actually have a dialogue with people about how we should meaningfully think about how we should invest, it's going to open me up to different sort of ways of investing, and possibly more useful ways of investing. So that was basically my point. I think you were kind of, I think what you were kind of saying is consistent with what I was saying, but just to kind of come back to you on that.
Next question.
Okay, thank you both. This was really interesting. I really like this one. Yeah. I don't know. Okay. Okay, I really liked having these kind of two different perspectives together. I saw a couple of ways that you were actually coming together. One, that you both believe that technology alone is not sufficient to solve many of the social problems that we are presented with, and that these sorts of debates often swirl around. And the other is that, I don't know, I think both of these perspectives are really coming from a place where there is, maybe at least taking this moment of technological change as an opportunity to adopt an ethos of experimentation and really be open to imagining alternative futures in a way that, regardless of what the technology is actually capable of doing, still helps us open some imaginative space. So I think both of your perspectives were kind of coming at these issues from that place. I wanted to hear more from Mike about, you mentioned, like, in a sense, kind of the limitations of the perspective that we can sort of put the finance capital genie back in the bottle, right? That, well, if we just roll back, I don't know, regulations and tax policy to what they were however many decades ago, that, that we're going to solve our problems, right? But I guess I wanted to get a better sense of your sense of, like, well, what does a transition to a more just and more democratic world of finance look like? Like, is it a matter of regulation kind of shrinking the power of finance as it exists now, and then opening space for more experimentation, more alternatives to kind of blossom? Like, what are the potential pathways to the kinds of things that you're talking about?
Yeah, that's a really useful question. I think there's a lot of things. There's a couple key things to think about when you're thinking about alternatives to a thing. One is the feasibility. Like, is this thing even possible? Like, could this thing ever work? Another is the desirability of the thing. Like, is this going to produce things that we actually want, or is this actually, when we put it into place, going to be a piece of crap? And then the third is thinking about, like, the durability of the thing. Could this thing actually be sustainable in any reasonable way, or is it going to, like, fall apart in 5 years because I don't know, whatever. People find ways to exploit it and it fails. I think we should be thinking about democratizing finance from a at least in the way I'm thinking about it, in all three ways. But to get at your question in terms of the feasibility way, what exactly do we need to do to make increased democratic mechanisms in financial institutions feasible? Some people would you have a certain section of progressives who would say things like nationalize banks, and there was probably a time in US, there actually was right after 2008 when even Alan Greenspan was like, we should nationalize these things. But that moment has come and gone. I don't think that is a feasible first step. I think a feasible first step is actually creating public banks, and it's most easy to do that at a municipal or a state level, and to create banks that are essentially financed in various ways in which you can actually institute sort of democratic mechanisms. And this isn't just some like pie in the sky, like there are actual efforts to do just this. Like there's an organization, Los Angeles Public Bank LA, there's a whole California public banking network. We have one public bank in the US in North Dakota, although it's not really run democratically. There's examples of democratically run public banks in Costa Rica. The Banco Popular is perhaps the most democratic bank in the world. It's run by a randomly selected group of 290 people that are chosen from different employment sectors. So you've got like the teachers represented, you've got the nurses, and they make decisions about bank investment. So I think that is like, that's the starting point for me. And I'm a maximalist. I want full financial democracy now. I want it to ratchet up. I don't want it to stay at the municipal level. But I think that's the most feasible and politically, it's most politically feasible first step, like the chartering of democratic public banks. Yeah, that's my sense at least.
To add to that, because I think to your point about how we actually have more in common than you would think, is that projects that are building around community currency are doing just that, except they're using it with a digital asset in that community. Because the idea is, what happens in the mining town that used to decades ago rely on the money that was basically issued by the mining company that was then used to pay for the bread in the town store? That's really what this is getting back to, is how do you bring that to those communities, and how, if you can, replicate it on the national or international level. And that's why I think there's also a lot of conversations, which we didn't talk about today, but around like digital currency issued by the government. What would that look like? And there are smaller communities like in Curacao and other outside the US that are experimenting with that because of inflation, because there's a desire for something that would be more verifiable than sending a check for COVID relief, only to find out that my former employer now has to hire a lot more of me formerly to investigate that the people that got those checks were actually not the ones that needed it, versus something that is on a public ledger that is verifiable. And this would be on the government level. Mm-hmm. So I think there's actually a lot that is being done on both sides, because to the banking point, the sovereign fund of Malaysia was basically robbed, and Goldman Sachs was charged and pled guilty because they allowed money laundering to, right? And so this is traditional finance taking from the community in Malaysia that really needed that money. So we have to solve for both of those things. That's why I don't believe that there's like the Web 2 versus Web 3. The issues need to be solved by everyone. And AI, I don't believe yet is ready to take over our thought processes or these discussions. When they are, then maybe I'll just leave, that's when I'm like, I'm out. But to your point, I think we do have a lot more in common, and there are a lot of use cases that are trying to solve for that with this new technology.
Thanks so much for that response. Next question.
We on now? Great. So I run guaranteed income experiments here at Penn. We have about, I don't know, something like 32, upwards of 20,000 people in our experiments we're giving away. I think our current portfolio, 165 million in unconditional cash in these experiments that are going directly to people in poverty. So my question is, I'd say on a biweekly basis, I get somebody from Silicon Valley or from cryptocurrency who's like, I am the answer to your problem. All you need is blockchain or crypto or both, and we can solve poverty, and we should run all of your experiments, and we are the answer. The gap between the trust in the community and the technology itself and cryptocurrency is huge. So the biggest barrier when we're running these projects is trying to convince communities who've been targeted by the worst that capitalism has to offer that I really am a white lady from Penn who's going to give you money, no strings attached. Like, that is a massive gap. And I'm one person, right, who's sitting there in someone's home trying to convince them of this and just hoping that they sign up for the debit card that's associated with it or whatever type of fintech that we're using. So I can see the potential, right, on one hand, in terms of like, let's have an imagination about ways we can reimagine finance. Then on the other hand, I'm also in communities all over the US who have been completely destroyed, and their trust in institutions is gone, completely gone, such that even if we were to design something that's perfect, like a perfect community bank, getting over that trust hurdle is still the biggest mystery for us to solve in this space. So I would love to hear both of your thoughts on the user experience side of that, particularly with people who've been targeted with risk, because it's not about literacy. It's not like, let's give you 10 classes on what crypto means or 10 classes on blockchain. That's not going to do it. Not with places that have experienced deep poverty. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. Thanks.
So I'll take that just because I have some really specific examples. So it's really challenging. And I think one of the reasons that I was drawn actually to Celo was to the foundation is that we had a whole team that would go out to communities and do research about what the community problems were and how they felt, right? What does it mean to have money on your phone? Or how do you use money? Or what were the scams, right? And that's part of the problem also. And it was a lot of listening and partnering, and you may know this, but partnering with the Grameen Foundation and Mercy Corps and people who have really on the ground knowledge of communities. And this to me is very similar to what you do when I was working with victims of crime. There is a level of distrust that is destroyed that if you come into a meeting and you think they're going to trust you right away from law enforcement, me as a prosecutor talking to someone maybe who is a victim from a different country who can't trust their government, that's silly. And that's really naive and inappropriate. And I think that time and effort and cultural sensitivity and understanding what that distrust is, but then on the flip side of it, you need to have the law and the enforcement of the law and clear rules to protect those communities. Because I agree that it's inappropriate to come in with a tool and test it in a community without some safeguards for that community that has access to it. And that takes time, and that takes also funding. And so sort of going back to my ideal situation, there would be more investment in those types of pilots, but with the right people to do it. Not just to say like, hey, I'm going to show you how to do this on your phone and, and self-host your own money and you can see it, but really be there sustainability in 2 to 3 years. So it's not just a one-off, right? Or a pilot for 50 people. but that is, I think, critical to having what I think the many in the industry want, which is mass adoption, right? Because it's the trust, and that takes time, and also having the infrastructure to have a relationship or trust with law enforcement also to hold bad actors accountable, which may not be the case if you're coming in and thinking, well, I'm going to solve all your problems. So that's like, you've been trying to solve this for 20 years and now you're going to maybe, but I think it's a lot of research, a lot of effort, a lot of time, and very hard to do as a one person.
Thanks so much. I think just in the interest of time, and so we can get through all our audience questions, we can go to the next question.
Thank you, both of you, for your time. Probably a lot less experienced than a lot of the people in this room, but I have a question anyway. So I was reading about a potential project where people in areas that are impacted by natural disasters, such as the Caribbean or even California with wildfires, in places where the brick and mortar banks are destroyed, and people are unable to get fast insurance payouts, people with smart contracts tied to things like NOAA data are able to get instant payouts with cryptocurrency. So they have a plan where to put their family in the event of a natural disaster, and how to rebuild a community after the natural disaster. And Mike, I was thinking about what you were saying about the externalities that blockchain technology isn't able to account for. And I was thinking about potentially having that be an investment towards rebuilding a more sustainable community, like a fire retardant home in California, or better areas in impoverished places in the Caribbean. But I was wondering who finances that and how can you incentivize that? Is that through coercion on the government level, or is that through more of a collective mutual investment?
I mean, I think it's through both. Like a lot of the proposals for public financing of things are a combination of financing through taxation, which is coercion, which I'm all for, and a combination of offering a certain guaranteed rates of return to people who want to invest their own money in the thing. And that would be with government backing. There's a whole different, you could give a basically laundry list of different ways in which a thing can be financed. But I don't think we should shy away at all from saying we should use some of the excess savings that our billionaires have to do this. Right, like there's a massive amount of excess savings sloshing around. That's precisely why the financial markets are so volatile. Right? People are investing their money, their savings to, to make profit. And I think there's nothing wrong with in fact, it's the morally right thing to do to get some of that. But there's also ways of incentivizing individual investors to sort of put money into these things by guaranteeing rates of return on those investments, what the government at different scales can do, right?
I think we have time for one last final question. So
okay, I'll be brief. Thank you. We're thinking of the perspective of a liberal democracy. We've been examining these questions, it seems, primarily from the democratic angle of liberal democracy. Is blockchain democratic? How could it be democratic, et cetera? But thinking about it from the liberty side, or even the libertarian side, one of the alleged promises, for some at least, of this new technology is that it allows financial transactions to occur, outside of the control of the state, not just avoiding state inflating currency, but avoiding state regulation. And I'd be curious if you think, either of the panelists think, that promise has been overstated to some degree. As far as I understand, most people who possess the digital currencies or the Bitcoin and other similar coins are still holding them in more traditional state-based financial institutions. It's technically possible, I suppose, to have them outside of the state, but in practice, does it happen as much? How much could it happen? What is the libertarian potential, or if you're an anti-libertarian threat of this technology?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there are people who have kind of are are interested in what this technology can do because they think it's anonymous. And I think that's like the biggest thing that I can dispel, which is it's pseudo-anonymous and there is some anonymity. But frankly, I like to give this example, which is if you're using digital assets on a blockchain, and let's say in theory, there is some sort of illegality that is happening. In traditional law enforcement, you have to go and like park your car and hope that the person comes out and it's surveillance, like hope success. On a blockchain, you're watching in real time. So law enforcement can watch the transactions and monitor who's doing that. So first, there's very little anonymity. It may be harder, like people use VPNs. There are ways to use certain types of technology on the blockchain to try to protect your, what you're doing, but it is pseudo-anonymous. But people are drawn to the idea that there are ways for them for what's called self-custodying. So you have a cold wallet or a wallet that belongs to you. And this came up a lot with some of the recent scandals and where people were custodying their funds, because if they were custodying their assets with a centralized exchange, similar to a Coinbase or FTX, then they don't actually hold their assets. So it would be like, instead of having cash in my pocket, I gave it and I left it with the bank. So when Lehman went down, the government had to save them because people were losing their money. And so that opened the debate about, this is why a libertarian or a community on a decentralized platform where you do not know who holds the central keys, provides, I think, a lot more freedom and control over what happens, because you're acting as the custody. You are in control of your keys, of your assets, versus something that's more centralized, and that goes to what are the regulations around that, and where can people feel comfortable that what a company is saying, services they're providing, can you really trust that in this space? And that's where a lot of the folks in conversation is, if you own your assets, you should hold on to them. You should be the custody of them, because then you know where they are and how you're using them and what you're investing them in.
Any points you would like to add?
Yeah, just very briefly on that. I think the idea of detaching the currency from the state is just a fantasy. Like it's a fantasy at best. It's extremely dangerous at worst. And I think there's plenty of reasons why we could go into that. But the thing I wanted to maybe touch on is the libertarian idea of freedom. To me, is about self-governance. And I think there's a misunderstanding of what self-governance means if we associate it with exclusively being able to decide where the money in your wallet goes. Self-governance, to me, it means being able to have a meaningful say over the things that are affecting your interests, that are affecting your life. And we live in a financial system in which the vast majority of the things that affect our lives are totally out of our say. And I don't think that cryptocurrency, especially like the Bitcoin bro, the Bitcoin maximalist, I don't think that in any way offers a way of increasing people's financial freedom. I think it actually simply deepens people's financial unfreedoms, and actually the way in which financial freedom is increased is by giving people a greater say over the things that actually affect their lives. And that's not holding Bitcoin. That's actually deciding how finance is allocated. So I think that, so I just think the libertarian to me is fantasy at best, dangerous at worst. On a positive note. Sorry.
That's awesome. It seems like an hour and a half has absolutely flown by. I just would like to thank our panelists once again, Matthew Roth, Jeff Green, and the Mitchell Center for hosting us for this excellent panel today. To my understanding, this is one of many in a series. So definitely be sure to come out to the following events that'll be happening over the next few weeks. But thank you so much, everyone. Really hope you enjoyed it. And yeah, we'll see you soon.